I want to start by saying that I've been debating writing this for a long time. Not because I'm afraid of not being believed, though I've thought about that too, spent more time on it than I'd like to admit in the early years. I've been carrying this for 8 years now, and I've arrived at a point where I no longer need anyone to believe me in the particular urgent way I once did. What I need is to put it somewhere outside my own head, because the inside of my head has been its primary residence for 8 years, and I think it's time to give it a different address. Not to evict it completely, because I've tried that and it doesn't work, but to move it somewhere more external, more fixed. Somewhere it exists in language on a page, rather than only in the texture of certain rooms at night and the quality of darkness in corners. I haven't checked recently, and the way I still, 8 years later, close my closet door before I sleep. I'm writing this partly for the people who played the game with me, some of whom I'm still in regular contact with, and some of whom I've lost track of in the way you lose track of people after the geography of your lives diverges. And I'm writing it partly for anyone who encounters something like this game and needs to know what they might be walking into before they walk in. Because I wish someone had given me this document before October of that year, and I have the information now, and the responsibility to pass it forward seems clear. My name doesn't matter for the purposes of this account. I'll call myself Mara close enough to my real name that I can write in it without losing the thread of myself. The others I'll give pseudonyms to protect them, because they've built lives since this and don't need it resurfacing attached to their real names. I'll use Dex, Priya, and Cass, and I'll describe them accurately enough that the people who know them will know exactly who I mean. And that's fine, because they've all read drafts of this and approved it. I was 19 years old when we started. Fall semester, sophomore year, a university in the Pacific Northwest. I'm also not going to name. I was living in a 4-person suite in one of the older residence halls, a building that had been renovated sometime in the early 2000s, but retained the bones of its original 1960s construction. The narrow windows and low ceilings and the specific quality of institutional air that older buildings have not unpleasant, just present, like the smell of paper that has lived in a room for decades and become part of it. We had been assigned the suite together freshman year and had requested to continue into sophomore year without much deliberation, because continuing together was the obvious thing and we all knew it. Dex was studying architecture. He had reorganized the common room furniture within the first 3 weeks of freshman year, producing a layout that was objectively superior to the original, and that we had all initially complained about on principle and then couldn't imagine undoing. He had the spatial intelligence of someone who perceives rooms as systems rather than environments, who sees the relationship between the position of a chair and the quality of the conversation that happens in it, between the angle of a lamp and the psychological temperature of a room. He was patient and precise, and occasionally so deep in his own focus that you could address him directly without registering at all, which was maddening and also in its way reassuring. The reassurance of someone whose attention, when fully engaged, was complete and reliable. Priya was in comparative literature and was the most widely read person I'd encountered at that point in my life, a condition that has only occasionally been matched since. She read across everything fiction and folklore and anthropology and cognitive science and philosophy and the kind of material that lives in footnotes and appendices of academic texts and that most people never reach. And she held all of it in a mind that was specifically good at finding the places where apparently unrelated things touched each other at unexpected angles. She was the one who found the game. She was always the one who found the interesting things, which was both one of her best qualities, and in this particular instance the origin of everything that followed. Cass was pre-med. She had the quality of attention I later came to strongly associate with the best physicians I've encountered, a sustained, patient, non-reactive observation that allows a person to notice things before they become obvious and to hold contradictory data without immediately resolving it into a premature conclusion. She was the most careful of the four of us, which is not the same as the most cautious, because careful people are not passive people. They're just very deliberate about when and how they move. Cass moved carefully, and when she moved, it tended to matter. We had been close since the beginning of freshman year in the way that people become close when they're living in compressed proximity, and the proximity turns out to reveal things worth knowing. I knew the sound of each of them sleeping through the suite's thin walls. I knew Priya's reading habits and the way she stacked finished books on the floor beside her bed in the order she'd read them. I knew Dex's coffee schedule and his habit of sketching on whatever surface was nearest when he was thinking through a problem. I knew the particular way Cass hummed to herself when she was reviewing material she already understood well, a low, absent sound that she was never aware she was producing. We cooked badly together and watched movies and studied in the common room and argued about things that mattered and things that didn't, and we were in the way of people who have chosen well, something like family, without the complicated prior history that makes actual family difficult. The game came from Priya. It was a Sunday afternoon in early October, the Pacific Northwest rain coming down in its steady October way. Outside the suite's narrow windows, the kind of day that is specifically hospitable to staying inside and doing something together. Priya had been reading about lucid dreaming practices and shared dreaming traditions and various forms of guided visualization used across different cultural and therapeutic contexts, which was the kind of reading Priya did for pleasure, and she had assembled from these sources a game she wanted us to try. The rules, as she explained them, were these: one person travels, one person guides. Any others present form a circle around them and maintain silence except during the opening chant. The traveler lies flat on their back with eyes closed. The guide sits beside them and places both hands gently over the traveler's eyes, not pressing, just covering, blocking the light. The circle links hands and begins chanting softly and in unison. The chant Priya had settled on was a single phrase chosen from something she had read about liminal threshold language in folklore traditions, repeated steadily at the pace of easy breathing. The house is waiting. After several minutes of chanting, or when the traveler seems sufficiently settled and inward, the chanting stops and the guide begins asking soft, leading questions. What do you see? What are you standing on? What do you hear? Where are you? The traveler answers, and in answering builds the place, describes it into existence. and the describing and the existing become the same thing in the particular way they do when a sufficiently open and receptive mind is given the right conditions. The place the traveler first arrives in becomes their entry point, and they must return to it before the guide ends the session. The guide counts down from 10 when ready to bring the traveler back. The traveler must be at their entry point when the count reaches 1. If they're not, the guide waits and counts again. Once a count begins, it isn't interrupted. You don't pull someone out mid-count. Priya was insistent about this. You never travel alone. This was the rule she was most emphatic about, and she was emphatic without being entirely able to articulate the specific reason which she acknowledged, because Priya always acknowledged the limits of her own certainty. She said everything she had read about these practices across every source and tradition and cultural context contained this instruction with a consistency that she found more significant than any single explanation of it. The guide is the anchor. The guide is the signal to your nervous system that the real world has not relocated while you were somewhere else. Without the anchor, she said you might drift. And drifting in the context of what these practices opened was not a condition to invite. The thing you were navigating in the game was a house. Priya had settled on this as the interior geography, partly because houses are the most universally legible interior space. The architecture of human habitation embedded in every person's body, knowledge, and partly because the game worked better with defined structure, with walls and doors and corridors, than it did in open landscape. The house was infinite, or effectively so. You could never find an outside wall. You could never reach a window that looked out on anything except more house, more rooms, more corridors receding into further darkness. It extended in every direction, and the extension never resolved into an edge, and the doors between its rooms were what you were there to find. Not all doors led forward. Some led backward to rooms already visited. Some opened into spaces that shouldn't have been able to fit in any logical floor plan. Some were locked, and remained locked regardless of how many times a traveler returned to them, as if waiting for something that hadn't happened yet. And some doors led to the rooms that each traveler was specifically there to find. The rooms that seemed to have been expecting them, which we would recognize not by any outward sign, but by a quality of the room itself, a resonance. A sense of arriving somewhere that had been holding a particular shape in preparation for your arrival. We gathered in the common room of the suite that first Sunday evening. The furniture pushed back and a specific arrangement of blankets and pillows on the floor. Priya lit a single candle on the low table we used as a surface for whatever needed a surface, and we turned off the overhead light, and the room became the room it would be for the next 6 weeks of sessions. Amber and warm, and contained a specific quality of illumination that became so associated with the game that for years afterward, certain lighting conditions would trigger a full sensory memory of that room and everything that happened in it. Priya traveled first. She was the guide most often for others, but she wanted to go in first to demonstrate the process. She lay on the blankets and I covered her eyes with my hands, and Dex and Cass linked hands with me and we chanted, and after a few minutes I began asking her questions, and she began describing what she saw. A kitchen. long and narrow, older in style, with white tile on the walls and a window over the deep sink. The window showed only darkness outside, regardless of the time of day she visited, which she mentioned the first session, and which remained true every time she returned. There was a round table with 4 chairs, though the chairs were always empty. There was a door off the kitchen that led to a pantry, and a door at the far end that led to a corridor, and a door behind the refrigerator that she didn't find until her 3rd session. The kitchen smelled like something that had been baked recently. Bread or pastry, warm and slightly sweet, though she could never identify a source for the smell. When she came back and we were all sitting up and the lamp was on and the candle was still going, she said it had felt like finding a room that had always been there. Not a room she had invented, a room she had arrived at. We all tried. We each went in once that first session. Brief exploratory sessions with the quality of first walks in a new neighborhood, just getting the feel of the geography, establishing our entry points. Dex arrived in a foyer with a chandelier that produced insufficient light to fully illuminate the ceiling above it. So you were always standing in a space whose upper dimensions you couldn't quite confirm. He said the chandelier was crystal, very elaborate, and that the light it produced was slightly blue in quality, cooler than incandescent. There was a staircase visible from the foyer going up, and a hallway going back, and 2 doors he hadn't yet opened. My entry was a long, carpeted hallway. The carpet was a deep burgundy, slightly worn at the center in the way of hallways that have been walked heavily for a long time. There were doors on both sides, all closed, all dark wood with brass handles. At the far end, a staircase going up. The hallway was lit by sconces set into the walls between the doors, producing a warm, uneven light. It smelled like old books and something faintly floral that I couldn't identify. I walked the length of it and touched the walls and touched 2 of the door handles without opening them, and walked back and told Priya I was ready, and she counted me out. Cass came back from her entry point with the least description and the most stillness. She said it was a waiting room. Chairs along the walls, fabric covered, the kind of chairs that are designed to be sat in for extended periods without being memorable in any way. A low table with a lamp on it. Linoleum floor in a neutral color. 1 door on the opposite wall which she had not yet opened. The room had no windows. The lamp was on, but she couldn't see a switch for it, and the plug was not visible. She described it in her precise way, and then she said it felt like the room knew she was coming and had been arranged specifically for her arrival, and then she didn't say anything else about it, and we moved on. We played twice a week for the next month. Always on evenings, always in the common room with the same arrangement of blankets and pillows, and the same candle and the same dimmed light. We developed the rhythm of it quickly, the particular quality of shared attention, that the sessions required a group focus that was distinct from studying together or watching something together. More concentrated and more interior, each of us present to the person traveling in a specific and sustained way. The house revealed itself gradually. What became clear after the first several sessions was that the house we were each finding was the same house. The geography was consistent. The rooms Priya described in her kitchen connected to rooms Dex described from his foyer and rooms I found from my hallway. When we compared notes, we found that the library I discovered down a left branch of my hallway in my fourth session was reachable from Priya's kitchen through the door behind the refrigerator. And when Priya looked in her next session, she confirmed the library was there, with the same details I had described. The floor-to-ceiling shelves, the rolling ladder on its rail, the reading tables with their green-shaded lamps, the books whose titles she could read, but whose content when she opened them was in a language she recognized the appearance of without being able to understand. We were finding the same place. We were finding it from different entry points, approaching it from different directions, building a shared map that none of us had designed, and that was more coherent and more consistent than anything 4 people inventing a shared fiction would have produced. I know what shared suggestion and collaborative imagination can produce, and I have a healthy respect for its capacity. But this was different in a way that all 4 of us registered separately and then confirmed when we compared our session notes. The differences between our individual experiences were the differences of perception and perspective, not the differences of separate inventions. We were reporting on the same place from different angles. This was wonderful, and also, if I'm being honest about what I felt at the time, and not only what I understand in retrospect, slightly vertiginous. The kind of vertigo that comes from a perceptual shift, from the sudden reorientation of a framework you thought was fixed. We had started this as a creative exercise, and it had become something else. Something that used the vocabulary of imagination while operating in a register that imagination didn't fully account for. We talked about this in our debrief sessions at length, and seriously the way we talked about everything, and we reached the working conclusion that we were genuinely uncertain what we had found, but that the uncertainty was not a reason to stop. Because the thing itself was extraordinary and the uncertainty was a reason to continue paying careful attention. The rooms we catalogued in the first month, Priya's kitchen with its dark window and the door behind the refrigerator, Dex's foyer with the blue-lit chandelier and the staircase and the hallway going back. My burgundy hallway with its sconce-lit doors and the staircase at the far end. Cass's waiting room with its fabric chairs and its lamp with no visible power source and its single door. The library reachable from both my hallway and Priya's kitchen with its floor-to-ceiling shelves and its rolling ladder and its books in unreadable languages. The greenhouse which Dex found through a door in the upper hallway that he reached from the foyer staircase and which was attached to what appeared to be a conservatory, warm and humid and smelling of earth and growing things, with plants I later spent an hour trying to identify from his descriptions and couldn't match to any species I knew. A music room which Cass found through the door in her waiting room containing a grand piano that she said was wrong in a way she struggled to specify, not wrong in appearance, correct in every visible detail, but wrong in the way it sat in the room and the way the room sat around it, as if the piano and the room had been assembled from the same materials but not quite fitted to each other correctly. A study that Dex found and that none of us could find again after he described it, which we noted. A nursery that I found by accident during my 6th session, stumbling into it through a door I had opened expecting a continuation of the hallway, and which I left immediately without studying closely. Just the impression of a small, pale room with a crib against the far wall and a quality in the air that I didn't want to spend more time with. A dining room with a table set for a meal that was never there, plates and glasses and silverware laid out with precision, but no food and no evidence that food was coming. A spiral staircase that connected from the upper floor of the house to a level below my hallway's floor, that none of us had found another access, to which we had been cautiously descending when each session ended, getting slightly further with each attempt. We were careful. I want to be clear about this because the account that follows involves things going wrong, and I want to establish that the going wrong was not the product of recklessness. We followed Priya's rules consistently. We debriefed after every session. We kept notes. We checked in on each other in the days between sessions and paid attention to whether anyone was feeling odd about anything, having unusual dreams, experiencing any difficulty distinguishing the game's interior world from the exterior one. Nobody was in the first month. Everything felt clean and contained. The house was on one side of a clear line, and our dormitory suite was on the other. The wrong thing started in November, about 5 weeks in. I want to be careful here about how I describe it because the way it started was subtle, and subtlety is hard to convey without either understating it into meaninglessness or overstating it into drama that misrepresents the experience. It started as a quality, a change in the quality of the house that none of us initially named, that each of us noticed and attributed to normal variation in the experience before we compared notes and found we had all noticed the same thing. The house was being observed in return. That's the closest I can come to an accurate description. When you traveled before this change, the house had the quality of an environment, something with its own existence and its own rules, that you moved through as a visitor. After the change, it had the quality of a space that was also watching you move through it. Not one specific location from which the watching originated. Not a presence in a room you could enter or exit. The watching was distributed through the house the way light is distributed everywhere and from everywhere simultaneously, a quality of the air itself, rather than of any particular thing in it. I noticed it during a session in my 3rd week of November. I was in my entry hallway moving toward the staircase, intending to try the spiral stair again, and I became aware that the hallway was aware of me. This is imprecise language, but it's the accurate language. The hallway knew I was there, not in the way a physical space can be said to know things through the passive effects of physics. The air displaced by my movement, the carpet compressed under my feet. Something more active than that. Something that was attending to me specifically. I told Priya, who was guiding. She asked what it felt like. I said it felt like the house knew I was here. She said, had it felt that way before? I said no. She said, did I feel safe? I thought about this honestly and said, yes, I think so, but I don't like it. She said I could head back to the entry if I wanted. I kept going. The feeling didn't intensify or change character. It was just there, consistent and present until I got to the spiral staircase and started down, and then it faded as I descended as if I had moved below its range. At debrief, I described it, and Priya said she had felt something similar in the kitchen a week earlier and had attributed it to normal variation. Dex said he hadn't noticed anything. Cass was quiet for a moment, and then said she had been feeling it consistently for about 2 weeks. We looked at her. She said she had noticed it first in the waiting room, which she described as being the most concentrated location of the quality, and then had found it in every other part of the house she'd visited since. She said she thought it was something that was in the house rather than something that was part of the house, a distinction she found important. And she said she thought it had been there since the beginning and was only now making itself noticeable because it was moving closer. She said this in the careful, measured way Cass said everything difficult. Dex said closer to what? She said she didn't know yet. I've thought about those 2 words more times than I can count. Not she didn't know. She didn't know yet. As if the knowing was a matter of time and continued observation. As if she was already gathering the evidence toward a conclusion whose shape she could feel without yet being able to name. We kept playing. I know how this looks, and I don't have a perfect defense for it, only an accurate description. We kept playing because the house was extraordinary, and because we were 19, and because the thing Cass had described didn't feel like a threat in any immediate or actionable sense. It felt like an observation, like being watched by something that had not yet decided what it intended to do about us. And the house was still giving us things room after room, still resolving out of the dark corridors, the shared map still growing, the experience still producing the specific interior richness that we had all come to value in a way that made the prospect of abandoning it feel like a real loss. We kept playing, and we told ourselves we were paying attention, and we were. We genuinely were. But attention and adequate caution are not always the same thing at 19. What I found in the second week of November on the lower level, reached by the spiral staircase, was the room with the mirror. I had been descending the spiral stair for several sessions, getting a few steps further each time before the session ended. On this particular session, I reached the bottom. The lower level was different from the upper floors in character, the ceilings lower and the light different. Not the warm sconce light of my entry hallway, but a cooler, diffuse illumination that seemed to have no source. That was just present in the air. The floor was stone rather than wood or carpet. The walls were plaster painted a pale color that read as either gray or pale blue depending on the angle. There was a short corridor with a single door at the end. I went to it and opened it and found the mirror room, small close to a large closet in its dimensions with walls papered in a dark pattern. I couldn't resolve into a specific design, a pattern that seemed to shift slightly in peripheral vision. Bare stone floor. The only thing in the room was a full-length mirror in a heavy, ornate frame standing against the far wall. The frame was dark wood, carved extensively in patterns I kept trying to follow, and losing the carving complex enough that a single focus point would slip into the larger pattern before I could trace it. The mirror itself was old, the silver backing slightly degraded at the edges, in the way of very old mirrors, the reflection it produced slightly warmer and slightly darker than a modern mirror would produce, as if it were reflecting a version of you that existed in slightly different light. I stood in front of it and looked at my reflection, and my reflection looked back and was mine. And then I looked more carefully. I looked with the careful attention I had developed over 6 weeks of sessions, the specific quality of noticing I had trained in the house, and I saw that the reflection was mine in every detail, and also not entirely mine in a way I couldn't immediately specify. The face was right. The clothes were right. The posture was right. But there was something in the quality of the reflection's relationship to my movement that was slightly off. When I moved, the reflection moved with me, but at a fractional delay, a lag so small that it existed at the threshold of perception, that I was not certain I was actually seeing and not simply producing through a kind of expectation now that I had started looking for it. I raised my hand slowly and watched the reflection raise its hand and looked for the lag and found something that might have been it and might have been the tremor of uncertainty in my own visual processing. I stood in front of the mirror for what felt like several minutes. Priya was guiding and she asked what I was doing. I told her. I said there's a mirror down here and I'm looking at my reflection and something is slightly wrong with it. She said, "What's wrong?" I said, "I'm not sure yet." She said, "How long have you been standing there?" I said, "I don't know, a few minutes." She said, "Mara, I want you to step back from the mirror and face away from it." I didn't do this immediately, which I note with some retrospective frustration, because I wanted to be sure of what I was seeing. Then Priya said my name again, with the quality in it that got through the distraction, and I stepped back and turned away. She said, "I'm counting you back now. 10, 9. I walked out of the mirror room and back up the spiral stair. 8, 7. I moved through the lower level corridor. 6, 5. Up the staircase into the familiar upper level. 4, 3. My burgundy hallway. 2, 1. I opened my eyes. At debrief, I described the mirror room in detail, the frame, the paper pattern on the walls, the quality of the reflection. Cass listened with her phone in her hand, taking notes and her face very still. When I finished, she said, "How long exactly were you in front of the mirror before you noticed the lag?" I said, "Perhaps 2 minutes." She said, "And you felt watched in the room?" I said, "Yes, but differently from the hallway. More concentrated, more directional, like it was coming specifically from the mirror surface rather than from everywhere." She nodded and wrote something in her phone, and then said she had found a mirror room too. Different location. Accessible from her waiting room through a door on the wall adjacent to the single door she had originally found there, a door that had not been present in any earlier session. Her mirror was in a room of similar dimensions to mine, similar quality of light, similar ornate frame. She said she had spent approximately 10 minutes in front of it before she became fully aware of the quality of the reflection's attention, and that by that point the lag she had been peripherally noticing had resolved into something she was no longer uncertain about. A consistent fractional delay that she had timed in her head and estimated at approximately a third of a second. She said that standing in front of it for 10 minutes had felt by the end of the 10 minutes like standing in front of something that was looking out at her through her own face. Nobody said anything for a moment after Cass finished saying this. Then Priya said, I want to look at the research again. She meant the material she had compiled before we started the folklore accounts and the psychological literature and the documented cases of similar practices she had drawn on in designing the game. She said she wanted to specifically look at accounts of entities encountered in these practices that used imitation and that she would come back to us when she had something useful to say. She went to her room and we cleaned up the session space and went to bed, and I lay awake for a while thinking about the third of a second, and what a third of a second is enough time to study in a mirror that has your face. Priya came back to us 3 days later with her laptop and her annotated notes and the specific quality of flatness in her expression that she had when she was reporting something she found genuinely concerning. She sat on the floor of the common room and she told us what she had found. The consistent element across the accounts she had located of these practices going wrong was not a specific type of entity or a specific precipitating event. It was a pattern, something that began in the shared interior space as a passive presence and became gradually an active one, something that did not announce itself, something that watched and learned and then used what it had learned. The using of what it had learned consistently took the form of imitation. It would present itself in forms the traveler recognized and trusted specifically to get the traveler to behave toward it the way they would behave towards something familiar, to lower the guard that you maintain with the unfamiliar and replace it with the openness that you extend to the known. It was not one shape. It was whatever shape was most likely to get the traveler to stop being careful. She said the mirrors appeared in a disproportionate number of the cases where things had gone wrong. She said they seemed to function as a mechanism for close study, a way for the thing to examine you under conditions where you were naturally inclined to hold still and look, where your sustained attention to your own image provided it with an extended opportunity to attend to you without your registered awareness of being attended to. She said she thought 2 minutes in front of the mirror was concerning. She said she thought 10 minutes was significantly more concerning. She said, "I think we should stop." Dex said, "What about the rooms we've already found?" Priya said, "We leave them." I said, "What if it doesn't leave us?" Priya looked at me, and the silence before she answered was one of those silences that contains its own answer, and what it contained was that she didn't know, that she had found accounts suggesting that abrupt cessation could produce its own complications, and that she was working on that question. Cass had been sitting with her phone in her hands during this conversation, not looking at it, holding it. She said, "I want to tell you all something." She said it in the tone she used when she had been holding information and had made the decision to release it. She said she had been seeing it for 3 weeks, not just in the house. In the house, yes, but also in the periphery of the house, in the threshold, places, the doorways she was passing through, the corners of rooms she was approaching. She said it appeared most clearly in peripheral vision and was harder to see when she looked directly at it, which she described as consistent with something that had not yet finished deciding on a form. She said it was always slightly different each time she glimpsed it, as if it were working on something running variations on a design it hadn't finalized. She said she had not told us because she had wanted to understand it better before alarming us. and that she recognized this was perhaps not the right call in retrospect, but that it had been her honest assessment of the priority at the time. Priya said this is the imitation stage in the accounts I found. This is exactly what precedes the thing presenting itself in a recognizable form. It's been watching you for 3 weeks, and it has been practicing, and you cannot go in tomorrow. The closing session we planned for you. You can't do it. Cass said I'm the one who most needs to do it. Priya said I know. That's exactly why you can't. They looked at each other for a moment with the specific quality of a conversation that has reached the point where both people understand that the disagreement is real and that it is not going to resolve through the normal channels of argument. Cass went in the next night, alone, without telling us. After we were all asleep, she set an alarm for 3 in the morning and went to the common room with a candle and guided herself, which violated every rule we had established and which she did with full awareness of doing it. She told me all of this 2 days later, sitting on the floor of my room with her knees up, her voice doing the thing it did when she was reporting difficult material, steady and precise and slightly flattened, as if she were presenting a case rather than describing something she had lived through. She said she had understood from everything she had observed and documented over the preceding weeks that the thing in the house had been learning her more thoroughly than any of us. She had been the most frequent traveler for the past 3 weeks. She had encountered it most often. She had the most extensive exposure to the close study the mirrors facilitated. She said she believed that if she went in with one of us guiding, she would be pulled out before she could do what she understood needed to be done, because we would read the session escalating and count her out early, and what she needed to do required time and presence that the precaution of a guide would not permit her. She said she knew this was the worst possible justification for doing what she did. She said she had made the calculation and determined it was hers to make. She went into her waiting room, the chairs along the walls and the lamp on the table and the linoleum floor, all exactly as it had always been. But the quality of attention in the room was unlike anything in any previous session. She described it as the difference between a room in which someone has glanced at you and a room in which someone has been thinking about you with great specificity for a very long time. Dense and directional and particular. Not the distributed watching quality of the hallway, but something focused and present and close. She sat in one of the chairs. This was deliberate. She sat down and placed her hands on her knees and looked at the door on the opposite wall, and she waited. She counted her breaths and she waited, and the attention in the room intensified, and she kept her eyes on the door. The door opened and it came through. It came through in my form. She said it was approximate at first, the way things are approximate when they are assembling, rather than arriving, the height and the build and the general shape of me. And as it crossed the waiting room toward her, the approximation refined itself, the details of me becoming more specific and more accurate with each step, the way a face focuses in a developing photograph. She said by the time it reached the chair across from her and sat down, it was wearing my face and my posture, and something very close to the quality of my presence in a room, in a way that she acknowledged would have been completely convincing under any other circumstances. Under conditions where she didn't know I was asleep on the other side of the suite wall. under conditions where she hadn't spent the preceding 3 weeks documenting exactly this process in preparation for exactly this moment. She said she took a breath and she looked at it directly and she said, "I know what you are." She said it aloud in her speaking voice to the room without apology. She said it the way she said things she was certain of without elevation or drama, as a statement of fact. The thing in my form was very still for a moment. Then Cass said what she had come to say, which she had prepared in advance and written out and read several times before coming into the room, because she understood that the prepared words were more reliable than the improvised ones under these conditions. She said, "You've been watching us. You've learned our shapes. You've learned what we look like when we trust each other and what our faces do when we feel safe. And I'm telling you directly that what you've collected is surfaces. The real things, the things that make these surfaces worth studying, are not visible from the outside. They're not available for collection. They exist in directions you can't approach from where you are. So what you have is incomplete in a fundamental way. And I want you to know that we know that. And I want you to know that we're watching you the way you've been watching us. And that we know where you are. And that we're not afraid of you." She said she had rehearsed this. She said she didn't know if any of it would change anything, but she needed to say it directly in the way a physician needs to address a condition out loud, even when the treatment options are uncertain, because naming a thing clearly is the first available action and the one that preserves the most subsequent options. The thing in my form looked at her for a long time. She said the quality of its attention during this interval was different from anything she had experienced in the house before, less the quality of a predator studying prey, and more the quality of something encountering an unexpected variable and processing it. Then it stood. It crossed to the door it had entered through and went back through it, and the door closed. Cass sat in the waiting room for 20 minutes. She counted the time. The thick directional attention in the room diminished by degrees. During those 20 minutes, the density of it easing until the room had the quality of a room in which something had recently been present and was no longer present. She stood and went to her entry point and counted herself out and blew out the candle and went back to bed. She looked like she hadn't slept when she appeared at breakfast. I asked what was wrong, and she said she needed to tell me something, and she told me all of it, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee in her case report voice. When she finished, I sat with it for a while, and then I got up and woke Dex and Priya. We had a long conversation that morning, all four of us at the kitchen table, with rain coming down outside, and the gray November light in the narrow windows, and at the end of it we agreed. We were done. No more sessions, no more individual explorations, no returns for any reason. Whatever the house was and whatever had been in it, we were leaving it where it was, and we were not going back. Priya said we should each spend a week with heightened attention to our own internal states, and that she had read accounts suggesting that leaving something like this abruptly could leave traces, residues, habits of attention that persisted past the practice. She said it in the clinical, detached way she said things that she was personally worried about. She also said, directly and without softening it, that Cass had done something extraordinarily reckless, and also possibly the most necessary thing anyone in our group could have done, and that both of these were true simultaneously, and that she wanted Cass to understand that she was holding both. Cass said she knew. The week that followed had a specific texture. We were all hyper-aware of our own perceptions in a way that was exhausting before it became ordinary. Checking the edges of our visual field, noting the quality of rooms when entering them, running automatic assessments of presence and attention that we had trained in the house and that now applied themselves to ordinary spaces, dormitory hallways and classroom buildings, and the library without our choosing to apply them. This faded as the week went on, and nothing unusual occurred, the calibration returning toward baseline as the distance from the game increased. Priya reported nothing. Dex reported nothing. I reported mostly nothing. Except for 3 days in the middle of the week when the corner of my room nearest the window had a quality I noticed before sleep that was gone by Thursday morning. Cass reported that she felt fine. She said it in the measured way she said things she meant, and I watched her face when she said it and saw what I believed was the truth of it. The specific composure of someone who has been through something and is in the process of metabolizing it into their understanding of how things work. She seemed more than okay. She seemed, in some way I found harder to articulate, settled. Like she had named something correctly and the naming had produced a kind of clarity. That was 8 years ago. We graduated. We went our separate ways in the gradual way that follows graduation, when the geography of lives diverges faster than the intention to maintain connection. Dex is an architect in Seattle. He works on residential projects primarily, and I have sometimes wondered whether the spatial intelligence he applied to the game's interior world shapes the way he designs rooms for people to live in, though I've never asked him directly. Priya finished a doctorate in folklore and cultural studies and is a researcher now, which surprised no one, and has published several papers on shared liminal practices in digital and analog communities, none of which name the game explicitly, but several of which I recognize the echo of. I teach 4th grade in Oregon. I have a husband who thinks my habits around salt dishes and closet doors, and leaving a specific lamp on at night, are quirky in an endearing way, and I have not told him what they're for. Not because I'm hiding it, but because I don't have a way of explaining it that doesn't require starting from the beginning. Cass is a physician. She finished medical school and her residency, and she works in a hospital now in internal medicine. And she has the reputation among her colleagues that I would have predicted for her from the beginning, for thoroughness and for patience, and for the particular quality of sustained attention that makes a patient feel fully seen. We talk every few months. She sounds like herself every time, consistently and completely herself, and the specific quality of listening for something wrong that I did in every conversation for the first 2 years after graduation has slowly and mostly resolved into ordinary listening, the kind you do with someone you trust. There is one more thing I want to include before I close this account. Last year I had a dream. I have not practiced any form of guided visualization or shared meditation since college, and I am careful about this. The kind of careful that doesn't require thought anymore, because it has been a settled habit for long enough to be automatic. The dream was ordinary in its initial qualities. The associative loose logic of a normal sleeping mind working through nothing in particular, and then it was not ordinary. I was in my entry hallway. I knew it the way you know a place you have been in hundreds of times immediately and completely. The burgundy carpet and the sconce, lighting and the brass-handled doors on both sides and the staircase at the far end. I was standing at the near end of it, and I was fully aware in the way you are sometimes fully aware in dreams that I was in a dream, and specifically in this dream. In this place I had not been in 8 years. Something was at the far end, at the base of the staircase, facing me. I could not see it clearly. I have said before that the thing in the house had no fixed form, and that it appeared differently depending on the directness of your gaze, and this was still true in the dream. In peripheral vision, it had an approximate human shape standing at the base of the stairs. When I looked at it directly, it lost specificity, the edges uncertain, the form suggesting itself without committing to itself. But the quality of its attention was unmistakable. The specific thick directional attention that I had first felt in the hallway all those years ago that Cass had described in the waiting room that we had all come to recognize as the thing becoming aware of us in return. I stood at my end of the hallway and it stood at its end, and we looked at each other across the full length of the house I had spent 6 weeks learning and then left. And I was aware in the specific way that certain dreams give you of something being communicated, not in language, not in image, just in the quality of the attention itself. Something being said in the way that sustained eye contact says things without words. I turned around and walked back the way I had come. There was a door behind me. I went through it and I was somewhere else. And then I woke up. I lay in the dark and I held the evidence of the real world carefully. My husband's breathing, the specific sounds of my neighborhood at night, the lamp I keep on in the hallway outside our room, the salt dish on the bedside table. I held all of it as something knowable and fixed and true, the way you hold something solid after a period of uncertain footing. Then I texted Cass. I said I had a dream about the house. I said I saw something at the bottom of the staircase. I said I thought it was still there. She responded in the morning. She said she knew. She said she had been checking in on it periodically in the way that you monitor something you want to know is contained, not entering the practice, just observing from a safe distance. And she said it had been in the area near the staircase for as long as she'd been watching. She said she believed the conversation she had with it in the waiting room 8 years ago had constrained something limited the range of its movement or its interest or both, but that constraint was not resolved, and she was under no illusions about that. She said the most important thing she could tell me was that she knew where it was, and she knew what it was not doing. I texted back, "Do you think it's still watching us?" She took several minutes to answer. Then she said, "Probably, but it knows we're watching it too." And then a period, just a period at the end of the sentence, which I read as the closest thing Cass does to an expression of settled acceptance of a situation that does not entirely warrant acceptance but has been thoroughly understood. I keep a dish of salt on the bedside table. My husband finds this charming in a vaguely superstitious way and has not asked about it at length. I keep a particular lamp on in the hallway outside our bedroom because certain qualities of darkness are more accessible with ambient light available than without it. I close the closet door before I sleep. which is a habit that started after the dream and which my husband has noted, and which I attributed to something I read about sleep quality and visual field simplification, which is not entirely untrue. I am not afraid. I want to be clear about this because the account might suggest otherwise. What I am is appropriately attentive to things I now know exist, and I have decided that appropriate attentiveness is a reasonable ongoing response to having encountered something that does not stop existing because you've stopped engaging with it. The distinction between fear and attentiveness is one I've spent 8 years refining, and I believe it's a real distinction and a useful one. If you've read this far because you've encountered something similar or because you're considering something similar, I want to tell you what I would tell the 19-year-old version of myself if she were sitting across from me. The game structure itself is not the danger. We did it for 5 weeks before anything changed, and what changed was not the game, but what the game made accessible and what had found the access point and decided to use it. The danger is accumulation. The longer you return to the same interior space, the more you establish it as real in the way that repeated attention makes things real. And the more real it becomes, the more available it becomes to things that are looking for places with those qualities. I don't have a satisfactory explanation for what those things are or where they originate. What I have is an account of encountering one. If you find a mirror in the interior space and the reflection lags behind your movements, even fractionally, even in a way you're not certain you're actually seeing, leave immediately. Don't study it and don't engage with it, and don't try to verify what you're observing from close range. Get back to your entry point and be counted out and tell your guide exactly what you found. Then have an honest conversation about whether to continue. If you see something that takes the form of someone you know and trust in a place where that person cannot logically behold the specific physical knowledge of where they actually are, not the general recognition of their face, not the emotional pull of the familiar, the verifiable specific particular knowledge of where they are and how you know it. That knowledge is the thing that holds. If you find a room with 2 chairs facing a fireplace, and something is in the chair across from you that looks like someone you love, do what Cass did. Say what you know. Say it directly and in your full speaking voice to the room without hedging it. Say you know what it is. Say what it has collected is surfaces and the real things are elsewhere. Say you are watching it the way it has been watching you and that you know where it is. I don't know if this will work for everyone the way it worked for Cass. I don't know enough about what it is to make that guarantee. What I know is that it worked 8 years ago and has held for 8 years, and that Cass is entirely herself, and that the thing is still near the staircase and not elsewhere. Be careful with the places you build together. Be careful with mirrors in those places. Be careful with anything in those places that learns your name. And be careful with anything that knows what your face looks like when you trust someone. That's the thing it wants most. That's what it was practicing for, and it is patient in a way that has nothing to do with the way we measure time, and it does not stop watching simply because you have stopped looking. Keep the lamp on. Keep the salt nearby. Know where your people are. This account was distributed through a private document sharing network before being posted publicly. The author has not confirmed their identity. Priya, contacted through professional channels, confirmed only that the account was substantially accurate, and that her subsequent research had been informed by these events. Dex did not respond to contact attempts. Cass, when asked about the account by a mutual acquaintance, said that the account was accurate and that what she had told the thing in the waiting room remained true. What it had collected was surfaces and the real things had remained intact. She declined to elaborate. The author has not returned to any form of guided visualization or shared dreaming practice in the 8 years since the events described. She checks in with Cass approximately every 2 months. Cass sounds like herself every time.